Rain pelted the broken street, turning mud into thick, sucking pools that trapped everything in its grip. Somewhere beneath the collapsing wooden fence at the end of the alley, a faint, rasping whimper broke through the roar of the storm. I froze, heart thudding like a drum in my chest, trying to pinpoint it. The smell hit first. Acrid, wet fur, and something fouler, something that spoke of weeks spent alone in the cold. Then I saw him, a tiny trembling shape, ribs jutting out like jagged rocks under thin matted fur, eyes wide with terror and confusion. He flinched at my approach, a tiny growl escaping, but it was hollow, desperate, more a plea than a threat. Lightning lit the sky, reflecting in his dark, haunted eyes, and I could see it there, the edge of death, sharp and real, lurking just beneath the surface of his frail body. And in that moment, I knew something had to change, or he wouldn't survive until sunrise. My hand shook as I reached for him, and in the storm's cacophony, I swore silently that I wouldn't let him disappear into the darkness. Not tonight, not ever. The rain fell in relentless sheets, each drop drumming against the tin roof of the abandoned alleyway with a rhythm that felt almost cruel. The night had swallowed everything in darkness, except for the occasional flash of lightning that revealed the city in jagged fragments, the glint of broken glass, the slick sheen of mud. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and rot. And somewhere beneath the collapse of a rusted wooden fence, a faint whimper cut through the chaos. It was so soft at first that I almost missed it, lost in the roar of the storm, but then it came again, trembling, sharp, and impossible to ignore. I crouched, the mud sucking at my boots, and peered into the darkness. My eyes slowly adjusted, and I saw him. At first I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the lightning, but no, there he was. A tiny shivering form pressed against the broken boards, fur-clotted with mud and blood, ribs sharp beneath the thin, ragged coat that did little to shield him from the cold. He lifted his head, eyes wide and dark, reflecting the storm like twin black mirrors. Fear radiated from him, pure and raw, so tangible it made my chest tighten. He flinched as I reached closer, a small hollow growl escaping his throat. It wasn't aggression. It was despair, the sound of a creature who had already touched the edge of life and recoiled. Lightning cracked the sky again, illuminating the details I hadn't dared to see before. His paws were torn, pads raw, caked in mud and grime. A mat of fur clung to his side where skin showed through, a muted scream beneath the grime. His breathing was shallow and ragged, the faint whine between each inhale carrying the weight of weeks, maybe months of neglect. I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat as instinct collided with helplessness. There was no time to think. This was now, and if I didn't act, he would vanish into the night, swallowed by rain, cold, and starvation. I moved slowly, speaking in a whisper barely audible over the storm. My words trembled, unpracticed and raw. "It's okay. You're safe. I'm here." My hand reached toward him, careful not to startle, but he flinched again, collapsing slightly under himself, eyes darting to the shadows as though expecting something worse to emerge. I froze, caught in the suspended moment where fear and hope collided. The storm was deafening, but in that silence between raindrops, I could feel his heartbeat, rapid and erratic, thudding against the ribs I could almost count beneath his fragile body. The first attempt to touch him failed. He darted backward, scraping against jagged wood, yelping in pain. My stomach twisted at the sound, every nerve screaming. I dropped to my knees in the mud, my own clothes soaked through, and spoke again, slower this time, letting my voice carry over the storm like a tether. "I won't hurt you. I just want to help." Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time fractured in the rain and the dark, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning and his labored breathing. Each flicker revealed more, a paw twisted awkwardly, eyes so full of mistrust they seemed to hold every betrayal he had endured, every moment left to fend for himself. And yet in that frailty there was a spark, something stubborn, something unwilling to give in completely. I clutched a rag from my bag, the only thing I had that might reach him without overwhelming, and in a quiet, deliberate motion I offered it. It was a lifeline, thin and fragile, but tangible and accurate. He sniffed it once, hesitation carved in every movement, then recoiled. My heart sank, but I didn't pull back. I stayed low, letting the rain wash over me, letting the cold bite through, every second a test of patience. I imagined him alone, shivering through nights worse than this, abandoned and starving, eyes wide with fear, searching for a hand that would never come. And in that imagining, something broke inside me. A mix of grief and rage and a strange, urgent determination. I couldn't leave. Another flash of lightning illuminated his thin frame, and this time I noticed something I had missed before. His tail, tucked so tightly against his body it was almost invisible, twitched slightly. A small sign, a flicker of curiosity or recognition, a minuscule thread of trust, and I clung to it. Slowly, I inched closer, talking in low tones, letting the rain soak us both, letting the mud cling to my hands. Finally, with a trembling stretch of courage, he let me touch him. One paw, then another, until I could cradle him carefully against my chest, feeling every tremor, every tiny heartbeat rattling like fragile glass. He shivered violently against me, but I didn't move. I let the rain soak both of us, my own teeth chattering, until his body began to relax, just slightly, leaning into me as if testing the safety of the world. I whispered soft reassurances, feeling tears mix with rain on my cheeks. This wasn't the end. Not yet, but was the beginning. In the chaos of the storm, in the mud and the darkness, there was a first fragile thread of hope, so delicate it could be broken with a single wrong move. I lifted him carefully, cradling him as I navigated the slick, uneven ground back toward shelter. Every step was measured, each movement a silent promise. I could feel his ribs beneath my hands, sharp and brittle, and every instinct screamed to run faster, to do more. But rushing would scare him. Patience was now our lifeline. He whimpered once, low and forlorn, and I murmured back, "I'm not leaving, not ever." The words tasted like rain in my mouth, like mud, like urgency, but they were honest. By the time I reached the dim safety of an abandoned shed just off the alley, the storm had begun to wane, leaving only the rhythmic drumming of water through cracks and gutters. I laid him gently on a bundle of dry blankets I had found, still wrapped in mud and rain. He trembled violently for a long minute, eyes fixed on me, searching, testing, hesitant to believe. I knelt beside him, letting him feel the warmth of my presence, stroking clotted fur slowly, deliberately. He flinched at first, then relaxed, the tiniest sigh escaping him, a sound that felt like life itself returning after a long absence. I sat in silence, the rain fading into a gentle drizzle, and finally let myself breathe. For the first time that night, I could see him not as broken or dying, but as a living, breathing creature clinging to the fragile edge of survival, and maybe, just maybe, willing to trust again. Outside, the world was wet and gray. But inside that small, battered shed, there was a moment of impossible peace. It was raw, it was fragile, and it was real. And in that moment, I swore silently that this was only the beginning. The first hours after rescue were quieter than I expected, but they carried a tension that pressed against my chest like wet cement. He lay curled on the threadbare blanket, his small body trembling in the dim, musty light of the shed. Every muscle was taut, every nerve alert, even as exhaustion tugged at him. I could feel the pulse of fear and the tremor beneath his ribs, a rhythm that had become as familiar to him as breathing itself. I wanted to reach for him, to cradle him. I sat cross-legged beside him, letting the rain's lingering scent cling to my clothes and hair, and spoke in the lowest, softest tones I could muster. My words were not clever or rehearsed. They were raw, guttural, stripped to their essence. "I won't hurt you. You're safe now. Just breathe." I watched his eyes, black and wide, flicker with something that might have been fear, defiance, or a tiny spark of hope I refused to name aloud. For long minutes, we simply existed in parallel, his body coiled tight, mine still and patient. Hesitation was etched into every movement he made. When I finally extended a hand toward him, it trembled, not with fear, but with the kind of uncertainty that comes from years of learning to expect betrayal. He flinched, lifted his head, and backed away until the blanket offered him a meager barrier. I froze, letting the silence stretch, letting the moments breathe. I couldn't rush this. Healing, I realized, would not be measured in hours, but in tiny increments. A touch tolerated, a step closer, a sigh released. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. I reached for a small bowl of lukewarm water and set it a foot away from him, speaking softly as I did. I didn't move toward him, didn't press, just offered sustenance. His nose twitched as the smell reached him. Slowly, cautiously, he inched forward, paws slipping slightly on the damp blanket. He drank in short, hesitant licks, eyes never leaving mine. Each sip was a tiny victory, a negotiation of trust. I exhaled silently, feeling a pulse of relief, but I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Fear had a long memory, and he had learned to survive by expecting the worst. I spent the next hours on my knees, barely moving, letting him acclimate to warmth and light. The shed was small, dimly lit by a single bulb that swung gently overhead, casting long shadows across cracked wooden walls. The scent of wet earth lingered in the corners, mingling with the faint, acrid smell of old paint and decay. I rubbed the mat of fur between my fingers, carefully untangling clumps of mud and grime, feeling him tremble with each touch. Sometimes he growled, sometimes he whimpered, sometimes shockingly, he rested his head lightly against my hand, testing the unknown. Every reaction was a line in the delicate, invisible dialogue between us, a conversation without words. By mid-morning, I had managed to coax him onto a patch of clean blankets I had layered beneath the first, offering warmth without pressure. His breathing had slowed, the ragged rhythm of the storm outside, now matched by a tentative calm inside. I watched him, noting every detail, the curve of his spine, the delicate flex of his paws, the way his ears twitched at every faint noise from the alley. He was fragile, yes, but alive, fiercely alive. And the realization hit me with both joy and a piercing awareness. The real work was only beginning. Feeding was another battlefield. I offered bits of soft, nourishing food, warmed gently in my hands. At first he sniffed, stepped back, recoiled. I spoke gently, coaxing, demonstrating patience I didn't know I possessed. Eventually, hunger won. He took a cautious bite, eyes wary, ears alert, body coiled like a spring ready to flee. Each mouthful was an act of bravery, a compromise with instinct. Afterward, he collapsed in exhaustion, small tremors rippling through him as he napped, the first taste of warmth and nourishment giving way to the fatigue of survival. I took this time to study him more closely. His eyes were windows to a life I could only imagine. Abuse, neglect, long stretches of loneliness where every shadow seemed to threaten death. Yet beneath the surface I glimpsed something else, stubbornness, resilience, and a spark of curiosity that hinted at who he might become. I whispered encouragement, running my fingers gently over his ribs, marveling at the fragile strength coiled beneath the matted fur. He flinched at first, but when I didn't pull away, he allowed the contact to linger, tentative and fragile, as if testing the possibility of safety for the first time in years. The day passed in quiet increments. I moved slowly, letting him explore the shed on his own terms. His first steps were halting, paws slipping on wet blankets, eyes darting at every sound from outside. I held my breath, letting him dictate the pace, guiding without forcing. By afternoon, he began to lift his head more often, ears flicking at the sound of my voice, tail twitching in faint acknowledgement. The first tentative tail wag was a victory so profound it made my chest ache with unspoken emotion. This small creature, nearly lost to the world, had started to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, not all hands brought harm. Night approached, and the air cooled, damp and thick with lingering storm. I laid additional blankets beneath him, letting him curl into a small, protective ball, still trembling but less rigid than before. I spoke softly, recounting the day in whispered tones, acknowledging every small victory, every hesitant step toward trust. He listened, eyes half closed. And for the first time that night, I sensed he believed he could endure, could survive, could begin again. I stayed with him, hand resting gently on his side, feeling his heartbeat slow in rhythm with the fading storm outside. As darkness fully settled, the shed transformed from a place of fear into a fragile sanctuary. Outside the city hummed and pulsed indifferent, but inside there was warmth, quiet, and tentative trust. I watched him sleep, the rise and fall of his small body a testament to survival, resilience, and the first fragile glimmer of hope. For the first time since finding him, I allowed myself to hope too. Trust, I realized, was not a single moment, but a series of tiny, deliberate choices. And tonight we had made the first of many. The days that followed were slow, measured, and heavy with uncertainty. Each morning, I would wake to the soft, hesitant sniffing of his nose against my hand, a careful acknowledgement that I was still there and, for the moment, still safe. The world beyond the shed felt like a distant threat, a vast expanse of shadows and unknowns he had learned to fear. Every sound, the rustle of leaves outside, the distant honk of a car, the flap of the broken roof, made his body tense, ears pinned back, tail tucked tightly. Yet despite the tension, there were moments, small and fragile, where he began to breathe easier, to stretch legs that had been cramped for weeks, to lift his head without flinching at the slightest movement. Feeding became a ritual of patience and observation. I learned the rhythms of his hunger. The way he approached a bowl with suspicion at first, sniffing every morsel, eyes flicking toward me, calculating, assessing. Slowly, he began to trust that food meant safety. Each meal was a fragile bridge, a connection that required more than sustenance. It required my consistency, my willingness to wait, to speak in whispers and let him dictate the pace. Watching him eat, seeing his ribs soften under gentle weight gain, I felt the quiet, heavy swell of hope. It was a hope wrapped in fragility, tempered by the reality that trauma does not dissolve overnight. The world inside the shed became our small universe. I laid out blankets, soft cloths, and little corners where he could retreat without feeling cornered. I watched him explore these spaces cautiously, paws testing textures, nose quivering at every new scent. Each exploration was a victory, every small victory a fragile affirmation that he could inhabit a world that no longer sought to harm him. Sometimes he would retreat, pressed to the floor, body trembling as memories seemed to surge from some hidden reservoir of fear. And each time I remained patient, offering gentle words, soft touches that never lingered too long, letting him know that he could emerge again on his own terms. Physical recovery was slow, deliberate. His fur, matted and dull, began to soften under careful brushing, each stroke of the brush a negotiation of trust. Some days he flinched violently. Some days he leaned into the contact with a small, cautious sigh. I documented each small change. The light returning to his eyes, the subtle straightening of his spine, the tentative wag of a tail at the sound of my voice. I spoke aloud as I worked, narrating each improvement, not because he could understand the words, but because voicing hope out loud gave it weight, made it real, like pouring warmth into the cold edges of his world. The emotional journey was mirrored in my own. I found myself speaking to him not just to coax trust, but to navigate my own fears, doubts, and grief. His fragility reminded me of the precariousness of life itself, of how easily hope can wither under neglect or cruelty. In the quiet hours, I would watch him sleep and marvel at the resilience packed into his small frame, the determination to survive despite the harshness of the world. I realized that my patience, my willingness to sit in silence, my presence alone, was as much a lifeline for him as for me. Play became the next frontier. At first he flinched at every object I introduced. Balls, soft toys, scraps of cloth, reacting as though the world was poised to strike at any moment. I allowed him to explore at his own pace, rolling the ball just within reach, letting him sniff and retreat, then try again. Each tentative touch, each hesitant paw against a toy, was a spark of life returning. When he finally dared to grasp a ball in his mouth, his eyes shone with a mixture of surprise and triumph, as if he couldn't believe that such joy could exist without fear. I laughed quietly, my breath visible in the cool air, and felt the first stirrings of something I had thought impossible that night in the storm. Unguarded joy. Evenings were the heart. The shadows grew long, the shed cold, and memories of abandonment seemed to seep from the corners, wrapping around him like invisible chains. He would tremble as I stroked his fur, his body tight and unyielding, and I would whisper into the dim light, reminding him that the storm outside no longer dictated his life. Some nights I stayed awake longer than I should have, listening to the shallow rise and fall of his chest, feeling the warmth of his fragile body against mine, and marveling that despite everything, life could still cling so stubbornly. Gradually, the moments of connection lengthened. He would rest his head on my lap, letting out a soft sigh, eyes closing briefly, only to snap open at the faintest noise. He would follow me short distances inside the shed, watching carefully, ears alert, tail twitching, and small signals of engagement. There was a rhythm to these days, a fragile balance between fear and trust, between past trauma and the cautious stirrings of hope. Every small step forward was a victory, every retreat a reminder of the road still ahead. One afternoon, sunlight finally broke through a crack in the roof, casting a soft golden beam across the blankets where he lay. I watched as he lifted his head, sniffing the warm air, whiskers twitching, eyes reflecting the first taste of curiosity rather than fear. He rose to his paws and padded unsteadily toward the light, tail flicking in a tentative arc. He paused, glancing at me as though seeking permission to explore this small patch of brightness. When I nodded softly, he stepped fully into the sun, letting it warm his fur, and I realized that trust, once earned, can shine even in the smallest slivers of light. By the end of the week, his transformation was subtle but undeniable. Ribs softened, coat gained a faint sheen, and his eyes began to hold life beyond terror. The first playful bark, a low sound with uncertainty baked in, made me laugh softly, tears slipping down my cheeks as I realized the depth of our shared journey. He had survived, yes, but more importantly, he had begun to live. Each day remained fragile, each moment of progress precarious, yet in the delicate balance of these fragile days, we found a rhythm. A quiet understanding that the world could still hold safety, warmth, and even joy. The fragile days taught me patience, humility, and the profound strength of small victories. They reminded me that trauma cannot be erased, only coaxed into manageable corners, that trust must be negotiated repeatedly, and that love, when earned, is the most powerful lifeline of all. And as I watched him curl into his blankets that night, breathing easier, no longer rigid with fear, I knew that the slow accumulation of these small, tender victories was shaping the foundation for a life no longer defined by suffering but by resilience, hope, and the beginnings of unguarded trust. The calm we had carved out felt fragile, as though any sudden noise or shadow could shatter it completely, and in truth it almost did. One afternoon, a loud crash echoed from the alley outside, the clang of a falling metal sign bouncing against the walls of the shed. He jumped violently, fur bristling, tail tucked tight, and for a long frozen moment, I wasn't sure if he would flee or collapse under the weight of fear. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, and his body trembled so violently that I felt every shudder as though it were my own. The storm outside had passed, but the storm inside him raged with full force. I knelt slowly, letting my hands fall just short of his reach, speaking in low, even tones, a steady anchor amidst his panic. "It's okay," I whispered, my voice a tether he could grasp if he dared. His ears flicked at the sound, hesitant, body coiled like a spring ready to snap. Minutes passed. Each second felt stretched into eternity. He slowly lowered his head, sniffing the air, testing my presence, testing the ground itself. The alley noise had become a monster he had to negotiate in his mind, a threat larger than the shed, larger than the walls that had become our fragile sanctuary. Physical setbacks arrived unannounced. One morning, I noticed his hind leg trembling as he rose to stretch, a faint limp that hadn't been there before. My stomach sank. Illness or injury in a fragile body like his could tip him backward, erase weeks of progress, and even threaten life itself. I moved with deliberate care, examining him, feeling every muscle for tension or pain, noticing every subtle reaction. His eyes held trust, yes, but also the shadow of wariness, the knowledge that nothing in the past had protected him from harm. I offered gentle reassurances, warm compresses, soft food, and the slow, careful administration of medicine, learning anew the fragility of bodies and hearts alike. Emotional storms mirrored physical ones. At times, a sudden flash of light, a loud voice, even the brush of a hand against the wrong part of his body would provoke a spike of panic. He would bolt to the corners of the shed, eyes wild, breathing ragged, fur standing on end. I learned to meet him where he was, never forcing proximity, letting fear exhaust itself on its own terms. I spoke to him in whispers, stroked him gently only when he allowed it, held a hand out as a lifeline but never pressed. These moments were tests of patience, stretching me to my limits, demanding that I confront not just his trauma, but my own frustration and fear. Yet within these storms, sparks of growth appeared. One afternoon, he approached the edge of the blanket pile to sniff a small toy I had placed there. I froze, letting him explore at his own pace. He touched it lightly with his paw, then recoiled, then tried again. Slowly, he began to bat it, the tentative play a declaration. I am alive, I am curious, I am reclaiming the world on my terms. I laughed softly, relief washing over me, but I didn't celebrate too loudly. Trust, once shaken, is fragile, and this small victory could vanish if mishandled. I spoke quietly, softly, so he could hear my approval without feeling cornered. The nights were particularly hard. Darkness drew out memories he could not articulate, shadows twisting into threats only he could perceive. He would pace in the shed, stop abruptly, crouch low, ears back, tail tight, trembling with unspoken fear. I would follow him slowly, speaking softly, placing a hand gently on his shoulder when he allowed it. Sometimes he would flinch violently, nearly bolting from my touch, only to pause a moment later, sniff, and settle again. Each repetition of this dance between fear and comfort was exhausting but essential. It was the rhythm of recovery. Slow, tentative, non-linear. A storm of another kind came in the form of the human world. Volunteers arrived to help relocate him to a vet for a checkup, and he reacted with full-blown panic at the sight of strangers. He barked, growled, and scrambled backward, retreating into corners as though every hand sought to harm him. I had to carry him gently, swaddled in a towel like fragile glass, whispering reassurance into his ear. The vet's office was another battleground. Strange smells, bright lights, hands probing, yet he endured. He endured because he had no choice, but also because he had begun to trust that I would not let him be swallowed by the unknown. Returning to the shed, I cradled him in my arms, feeling the residual tremors of fear ripple through his small body. I spoke softly, stroking his fur, noting each flinch, each soft exhale of relief as he realized the danger had passed. These storms, I realized, were not failures but tests of resilience, both his and mine. The unpredictability of trauma would not vanish, but the shelter we had built, however fragile, was now a place where storms could pass without devastation. Amid the turbulence, small victories appeared like fragile flowers through cracks in the asphalt. He allowed brief moments of play with a string or soft toy, nudged my hand for attention, even accepted brief belly rubs when no noise interrupted the room. Each small act of connection carried enormous weight, proof that even in the midst of fear and setbacks, trust could be rebuilt. I learned to celebrate these moments quietly, savoring them, knowing they were evidence of growth forged under duress. By the end of the week, he had faced multiple storms, noise, injury, unfamiliarity, strangers, and each time emerged with slightly more confidence. His body was steadier, his gaze clearer, and while fear remained a constant companion, it no longer dominated. The lessons of these storms were twofold. Survival requires resilience and trust. Once fractured, demands patience, empathy, and unwavering presence. In observing him, I understood the delicate balance of life and recovery, the interplay of external chaos and internal courage. That night, as rain lightly tapped the shed again, we sat side by side, bodies close but not forced together, sharing warmth and silence. He rested his head near my hand, ears flicking at every sound, eyes alert but calm. I could feel the tension in his small body ebbing slightly. The storm had not left him unchanged, but he had endured, and in that endurance, he revealed something extraordinary. The capacity to grow despite trauma, to reclaim life piece by piece, and to allow love, however fragile, to anchor him. In the quiet hours, I reflected on our journey. The storms, both literal and metaphorical, had tested us, threatened to unravel progress, and exposed the raw edges of trust and resilience. Yet within these trials, a bond had solidified, a bond built not on convenience or coercion, but on patience, empathy, and shared struggle. He had begun to understand that while the world could be cruel, there were hands and hearts willing to protect, to nurture, to save. And I, in turn, had learned that love often arrives not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, repetitive acts of presence and care. The first morning of true calm arrived with a soft golden light spilling through the cracks in the shed's roof. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving behind a smell of wet earth, sun-warmed wood, and faint traces of the storm that had nearly claimed him. I watched him stretch slowly, his body no longer coiled in fear but moving with a tentative, cautious grace. His eyes caught mine, black orbs softening with something I could only describe as recognition, not just of me, but of the world itself. He had survived, yes, but now he was beginning to live. We moved carefully out of the shed, into a small fenced yard I had prepared for him, a safe space where the shadows of his past could not reach. The grass was still wet, blades bending under the weight of early morning dew. He hesitated at the threshold, ears back, tail low. I knelt, speaking softly, letting the air between us carry reassurance instead of command. "It's safe," I whispered. "You can take your time." Slowly, as if testing reality itself, he stepped forward. One paw, then another, until he was fully in the sunlight. His nose twitched at the new smells, a tentative sniff of freedom and warmth that had eluded him for so long. The first tentative walk around the yard was awkward, unsteady, and yet full of quiet wonder. He paused at every new sound, every whisper of wind through the grass, but he did not flee. He circled, sniffed, explored the corners, and then returned to me briefly, glancing up with cautious eyes as though seeking approval. Each return felt like a triumph, each cautious step a declaration that he was reclaiming the world piece by piece. And when he finally barked softly, a low, uncertain sound, I laughed quietly, tears prickling the edges of my eyes. That sound was joy emerging from fear, life unfurling after months of darkness. Over the next days, routines formed. Feeding, gentle grooming, and long, slow walks outside became anchors. I learned the language of his hesitations, the signs of comfort and anxiety, the rhythm of his trust. Every small act of care was a thread weaving us together, strengthening a bond forged in survival and patience. He began to greet me with quiet excitement, a wag of the tail, a soft nudge of his nose, gestures that once would have been unthinkable. The shadow of his trauma remained, yes, but it was now tempered by moments of trust, joy, and safety. Play became our shared language. Soft balls, squeaky toys, even chasing shadows along the fence brought sparks of delight to his eyes. He learned to anticipate warmth, to seek comfort, and to trust that hands were not instruments of harm. Each leap, each playful bark, each moment where he curled against me without fear, was a victory not just for him, but for the fragile bond that had grown between us. The world had been cruel, but in these small reclaimed moments, it was also capable of beauty, safety, and love. Evenings were quiet but filled with intimacy. He would curl beside me, body warm and relaxed, for finally soft and glossy eyes heavy but peaceful. I traced gentle lines along his back, feeling the strength that had returned to his muscles, the softness that came from care and nutrition, the life that now pulsed fully beneath the surface. I spoke softly about the day, recounting victories, consoling fears, acknowledging the slow, deliberate work of trust. And sometimes, just sometimes, he would lean into me, resting his head against my chest, eyes closing in complete acceptance, a silent testament to the resilience of the spirit. The outside world no longer intimidated him as it once had. Neighborhood children passing by no longer caused panic. The sound of distant traffic became background noise, and even sudden movements failed to trigger the violent tremors of fear that had once defined him. He had learned to exist beyond survival alone. He had learned to inhabit life fully, and in watching this transformation, I felt my own heart expand, aware of the profound gift that trust and patience can bestow, not only upon the one healed, but also upon the one who dares to save. One afternoon, I watched him chase a butterfly across the yard, small paws skimming over wet grass, ears alert but free, tail high in tentative triumph. He stumbled once, paused, then continued, a perfect mixture of clumsiness and grace. I called softly, and he ran back to me, body gleaming in sunlight, eyes alight with joy. There was no hesitation, no fear, just the unguarded delight of a creature who had been brought back from the brink. I knelt, arms open, and he leapt into me, the warmth of his small body pressing against mine, a silent declaration of trust and belonging. Night fell, and the world outside became quiet again, but it no longer felt threatening. He curled beside me on a blanket under the soft glow of a single lamp, ears flicking occasionally, but body relaxed, breathing steady. I stroked his fur, feeling the gentle rise and fall of his chest, and marveled at the journey that had brought us here, from the storm-soaked alley to this safe, warm haven. The fear that had once defined his existence had been tempered by care, patience, and unwavering presence. He was home. Truly, completely home. In those quiet hours, I realized the transformation went beyond physical recovery. The dog I had found trembling in mud and rain, on the verge of death, had grown into something resilient and alive, capable of trust, joy, and love. And I, in turn, had changed, humbled by the fragility of life, awed by the power of patience, and deeply moved by the capacity for connection between human and animal. The scars of the past remained, yes, but they were no longer chains. They were markers of survival, reminders that even the smallest spark of hope, when nurtured, can ignite a life fully lived. And so, in the quiet of that first peaceful night, I watched him sleep, chest rising gently, ears flicking softly, tail relaxed. Outside, the last traces of the storm had faded, the world bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. Inside, there was warmth, there was trust, there was home. And in the stillness, I whispered softly, "You are safe, you are loved, you are home, For the first time, it was more than words. It was truth, radiating from every small living gesture of this once frightened, now transformed creature. And in that moment, I understood something profound. Survival is remarkable, but home, and the love that builds it, is miraculous.